Welcome, everybody, with that tantalizing glimpse of Ojai and its spring finery. It's a pleasure to welcome you. We are joined today by Susie Ibarra and Marcos Balter, two of the composers central to the 2025 Ojai Festival, curated by Claire Chase and close musical partners of Claire's, both having written very substantial works for Claire, or with Claire in mind, that will be featuring at the festival. Susie Ibarra is currently in Berlin, Germany, on an extended artistic fellowship that brings artists from all over the world to Berlin. It's called the DAAD. And because as we're having this conversation live, it's 2:30 in the morning in Berlin, we decided to spare Susie the middle of the night intrusion and conversation. And a couple of days ago, I recorded the conversation with Susie. Happily, Marcos Balter is with us live for this session, and in the second half hour of our time together, we'll have the joy of speaking with Marcos. But we'll begin with this previously recorded conversation with composer Susie Ibarra. It's such a treat to welcome Susie Ibarra, who will be central to the Ojai Festival as a composer and percussionist. Susie, thanks so much for doing this.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really delighted and honored to join you all in Ojai.
And I know as we are speaking, you're home in Berlin at the moment, which is an unusual location for you. Tell us what's taken you there and what projects you're involved in while you're in Berlin.
Yes, well, I guess a fellowship with the DAAD artists in Berlin and music and sound brought me to Germany and Berlin, and kind of an extraordinary community of collaborating, focusing on my sound research and also on composition. So it's been um, it's been really productive time, I think, to be here at this moment and for example, the Nest Box I wrote over here.
Let's jump back for a minute as some of our audience meets you for the first time and talk about origins. Your family is from the Philippines, but you were born in the US. What's your early geography?
Yes, my family is from Manila, and I was born actually in Orange County. Yeah, I was born in California, and then I did my grade school in Houston, and I spent a long time living, and especially my adulthood in New York, both in New York City and also just above, even if we say upstate New York, not truly upstate, but like hour and 40, hour and a half in New Paltz in the Hudson Valley.
So you've been surrounded by nice nature for a lot of your life, right?
Yeah, I think it's kind of subtle what we have as a childhood, our experiences, and how these early experiences impact our lives continually, and how that affects the new experiences that we have as we grow as adults. And I do think that a lot of my childhood experiences have impacted uh, the kind of natural environment and how how I think about and live in natural environments, and also the natural environment in our urban and built environments. And I just have to say also, I was really delighted and honored to be invited to also play at Ojai Anea Lockwood's Bayou Born piece for Pauline Oliveros, that Claire and Anea were arranging for this unique ensemble. And having also both known Pauline Oliveros from originally meeting in California, but we have Houston in common. I grew up along these bayous.
Mm.
So I also have a bit of a full circle childhood that I um, return to a little bit of that which is very specific um, kinds of river systems that move through the city and also out into the suburbs and the rural areas. Here in Berlin, they have a very long river. It's called the Spree, and up, no, just south of it an hour is the Spreewald, the Spree Forest, and an area which will also right along the river, which will have a lot of birds coming in very soon right now. But it also, while it's different, it is a bog. And I think about that also. Um, Interesting, just interesting the different natural environments and how we might gravitate to them, as well as I think of our larger ocean bodies, and which we have, so wild and big, the Pacific, right, as well as the Atlantic, and um, seeing that from different continents and stuff has been interesting.
And what about sort of the musical environment that surrounded you as you grew up in California and Houston and then through college in New York, et cetera? What were some of the formative musical surroundings that stuck, that helped shape you, and the moment in which you realized that music is your life?
Oh wow. Um, I started music when I was 3. My family is all played instruments. My mother put me in piano very young, and then I sung in choirs. I didn't start playing percussion till I was a teenager. And then I also played drum set as a teenager, but I also played piano and organ in church.
Mm.
And then I would play in high school. I played drums in like punk bands, and somehow it balanced. And I was also a visual artist in Houston. I came in for my schooling in New York. I came up as a visual artist,
Mm.
and and I always did both. And then I think it was as a teenager um, in New York, I realized, oh wow, I really I feel it's quite easy to express myself through the musical medium, and that it's still very visual. I think the process of writing scores, not necessarily always what comes out in the end, but for sure in the process, there's a lot of visual side. And now for me later in my life, the materiality of the sound is also very physical and visual alongside with the audio side. So that always stayed with me. I went to school in both Sarah Lawrence College and Mannes College of Music. Yeah. So and then I also, it was a time in New York City. I love to play percussion. I had a wonderful time, difficult time, but also wonderful time. Like I got to play a lot of different percussion ensembles and study with a lot of teachers directly, not even just from in school, because of the magnitude of the culture in New York for performing arts, for live music also. And that I think was really fortunate. It was so mainstream.
Mhm.
It was just so mainstream and and accessible for in my generation for young artists. It was so accessible, and that might be part of the reason why it shifted in that way. I mean, early on, before I came to New York, I was out in Parsons in LA as a visual artist. So it's something that's always stayed with me. Um, but that was early on. I guess also my parents, we were in a Philippine community, so we would often. It was this in the Gulf. It was Houston, Fort Worth, and New Orleans, and there would be sometimes these tours of Philippine choirs that would come through the
Mm.
communities. So we would always be part of the community that was hosting these choirs to come in and and artists, and so that was, I think, very fortunate for me. And I first saw like Philippine Kulintang gongs in my uncle's house, and I didn't know how to play them or what they were, but I was very intrigued by them. Yeah, um, and then later I would start to play in several gong ensembles. I played Philippine Kulintang, I played Balinese and Javanese gamelan in in New York, and then later I would go on to study in Manila and stuff, and then also down in the southern island in Mindanao with the lot of the family legacy of one of my dear mentors who's now passed on, Danoman Kalanduyan. And that was very formative. I mean, I think early on in New York, I mean, I had a few opportunities if I wanted to actually move in that direction to uh, more seriously study in Southeast Asia at the time. I was playing so much percussion, I had to really focus it because and say, okay, I can play all of this, but not at the same time, and I should, take step by step because it is always another instrument. Even though if it's we're playing percussion, each instrument takes so much practice and so much time, and um, and so yeah, I had to figure out how was that path going to lay out for me because you can't do it all at the same time. There's so much rigor behind all of it and a lot to take in and think about, and the musicality and the body memory of the performer side of music. So much body memory on that side. Yeah, so that's a little bit of it.
You've mentioned obviously the presence of Philippine music traditions in your life. In one of the big pieces that will be central at Ojai, Sky Islands, the physical landscape of the Philippines also is very much evoked and present. It's a piece. I had the privilege of hearing an early version of it in New York at the Asia Society. It's a piece for Claire Chase for flute, for Alex Pei, pianist, yourself and Levi Lorenzo playing percussion and traditional Philippine instruments as well, and a string quartet, which in Ojai will be the Jack Quartet. Could you tell us sort of the genesis of Sky Islands? What are the Sky Islands? Where are they? And how did they help give shape to the music that emerged?
Yes, sure. Well, Sky Islands, they only exist in a few parts of the world. And so one of the places is in the northern island of Luzon in the Philippines. And they are the high mountain, altitude rainforests. So they really are up in the clouds. And it's interesting. I was always curious because people would say, we feel like up there evolution speeds up because we have at least 50 species that grow here of different animals that only exist in this high altitude area. And, obviously less humans there. And the kind of biodiversity in both the flora and the fauna of sort of very precious space and rare, not so many of them. And what does that mean? Like these spaces are very important as our planet evolves and the climate is changing. It's really important for all of us, these places. But I also felt they're, metaphorically really magical. What the sound of that, and having also one of my practices to record in forest, record trees, or record also certain resonances in caves and stuff, and then of course recording water. I still feel whether I'm in that research practice of listening or if I transform that and come to the magical page of the score or the magical stage of performing it, it's still it gives that there's so much sound to explore and be inspired by.
I think I'll let everybody in on a wonderful piece of your research for Ojai. I had the pleasure of putting you in touch with Tom Maloney at the Ojai Valley Land Conservancy, because two of Susie's pieces will be featured in a very special environment on early Sunday morning in the Ojai Meadows Preserve, which is one of the beautiful properties managed and really shepherded and stewarded by the Ojai Valley Land Conservancy. But you actually, as part of your research, asked to know about specific birds in Ojai, right? And
Yes,
the
I
bird
have.
songs and
Mhm.
that also led to a brand new piece you're writing for Ojai called Nest Box, which will be on the Sunday morning 10:30 concert. So talk to us about this integration of your research into your writing.
Yes, I've always really loved bird songs. I think it's something that is kind of natural for many musicians, many composers, performers, many musicians. It's something that really lends itself. Also, as a percussionist, I feel they're one of the oldest drummers.
Hmm.
You know, they've been around so long, and I do feel that rhythm, pitch, melody, harmony, we have been playing their songs a long time. You know, I think about that often because I also research and transcribe bird songs. But some of the birds that Tom had said are in the preserve are Cassie's kingbird, the California towhee, house finch, the house wren, and Bewick's wren. Those are a couple that are actually inspiring in the new piece Nest Box with um, virtuoso Wu Wei on Sheng, and um, I will play this in duo in also uh, dedication to Steve Schick. And also part of that idea of naming it Nest Box, you know, it is a place that nurtures these birds. And I felt that even though, well, I'll reword that. um, I felt that be very appropriate in dedication, you know, of this symbolically of what a nest box is. But also, you know, a nest box, you might have a pendulum that keeps out certain birds, what can be in some like who's going to come in, who's going to go out, and that whole playfulness. So Wu Wei and I are going to play a very playfulness of what that habitat is, and these kinds of, you know, taking on these birds as roles and moving in and out. That's a lot what this piece is scored and inspired by, and particularly by the bird songs from the preserve. I'm very excited to be out in the preserve for the first time also. And there'll be two other bird songs. One of the bird songs, Sunbird, which I wrote solo for Claire. She's arranging for four woodwinds, and I'm excited to hear that. And then I will also play Colibri, which is a Philippine hummingbird. And
Hmm.
I think they're very similar birds, sunbird and the hummingbird, but they're different families because the sunbird is more in the nectar family of birds, and the hummingbirds are one of the interesting things about hummingbirds is I think they're one of the few, if not only birds that can fly backwards. You know, they have these different motions and stuff, and that deals a lot with how the movement of that piece is and dictates how motifs will move. But these small birds, they're really I'm enamored by them. Yeah, they're beautiful and essential. So yes, we will play them early in the morning. Yeah, and then Wu Wei's we will also play them, I think, on the morning program, right? On another morning. So I think that's kind of appropriate. All the birds are coming out in the morning. Yeah.
Um, Susie, one last question. You talked about the collaboration with Wu Wei. Wu Wei is the fantastic shang player, which is the Chinese mouth organ. If our listeners don't know the instrument, imagine sort of a harmonica as a pipe organ, and that begins to give you some idea. And I know this was a relatively new encounter. It's a match made, and because
Really a new encounter. Yes,
you and Wu
extraordinary.
Wei, and I
Yes.
know that the two of you have had a chance to meet,
Yes.
just work together. Tell us a little about that process and how, in a way, it fed the writing of the piece.
Oh, yes. Well, he also just came back from China when I first met him, and he's like, "Here's the composition." So I got to come home with a composition. Well, that's very obviously very clumsy, but I think I understood, why it's essential for him to have us explore that and feel this 37 reed instrument and was so generous to demonstrate several many of the techniques and has written quite a few books and taught on on the instrument, so which is pretty profound, especially in China. There's like volumes, of how from the legacy of his teachers and what his teaching is on that. So it's very helpful to see that, and also just a tremendous organ is definitely a great way to describe it in a way, because I actually live now in a country that is has a lot of organ instruments, and I just also wrote a large work that had pipe organs. So it was a
Hmm.
time of listening to reeds, these different reeds, and it is very similar because his command of the instrument, the facility of so much different sound and technique that can come out of that just this instrument. You have to also heat it up on the bottom. It's like you have tea, heat that up, this, so on. And they're black bamboo. When you all come out to listen, you'll see it. It's beautiful. Each of them come out. You know, I was just kind of floored by the technique. I mean, Claire did say, "Oh, Wu can play anything," and if Claire said that, I said, "Oh, okay." So, um, yeah, yeah, we're getting ready to. We're just sorting our schedule. So even before we come, we're so lucky because we're in Berlin, even though she's traveling a lot. But we're sorting that, so we should have some rehearsals even before we have rehearsals in Ojai.
Well, there's so much to look forward to, including Nest Box, this new piece written for Ojai for the Chinese shang and percussion. Susie, we could talk for much longer, and I hope we will when we're together. But I just wanted to thank you for the generosity of your music making, your spirit, and the collaboration that you're bringing to everything. It's just a treat to be with you, and thanks for this time.
Oh, thank you, Ara. I'm really honored and really looking forward to being with you all in Ojai and all of this extraordinary music.
That's a conversation with percussionist and composer Susie Ibarra, one of the central musicians at this year's Ojai Festival, and it's a conversation we recorded a couple of days ago as Susie lives in Berlin, and the time difference didn't allow her to join us live. And there is indeed much to look forward to, including our very next conversation with a composer who I admire so much, and I'm so delighted is finally coming to Ojai. He said he's coming to Ojai for the first time, so please join me in welcoming Marcos Balter. Marcos, we're both somehow, I don't know how we managed to do this, but we're both sitting in an unusually cold spring day in New York, dreaming about Ojai.
Very
Welcome.
much so. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you are. It's so great to be here. And yes, Ojai has been on my bucket list for a very long time. I've had pieces performed at Ojai, but I've never been there physically. And I keep hearing all these amazing stories of what it means to listen to music in those spaces. And I'm so looking forward to it.
Well, and we will celebrate in style with several pieces of yours, including on the opening night, two pieces. Alone, a smaller, shorter piece for solo flute and other instruments we'll talk about in a moment. But really, the central event of the opening night, your sort of epic community ritual piece written for Claire Chase called Pan. And then later in the festival, a beautiful, beautiful string quartet called Chambers that the Jack Quartet will be playing. But as we did with Susie Ibarra, let's jump back a little bit and start with some both personal geography. You were born in Rio, and the formative years of your life were spent in Brazil before coming to the US to study in your college years. Talk to us a little about what surrounded you growing up, and particularly in a way, just as Susie explained, what music fed you. It's one of the richest musical countries on the planet, and I've never actually asked you what you grew up hearing, listening to, and playing.
Everything. So I am from a family of non-musicians. Both my parents are physicians, but music was always very present in my life. My dad plays the guitar. My mom used to sing in choirs. There were a lot of high school choirs in Brazil, sort of a legacy of the Villa-Lobos times, of having the Orpheonic choirs in school. So at every single party in my house, my dad would get the guitar and my mom would sing. So they were not professional musicians, but music was very much there. But it was primarily popular music, Brazilian popular music, more specifically, what we call MPB, sort of the Caetano Veloso and Chico Buarque and Edu Lobo and Antonio Carlos Jobim, that kind of repertoire. A lot of samba as well, but not a lot of classical music. And for whatever reason, that was the kind of music that attracted me and attracted my ears. So there was a little bit of sort of, solitary discovery or discovery by proxy, having some people helping me along the way to come across music that I didn't know. But there was this preparedness that was very much part of how I grew up, of being open to different kinds of music, of being open to make connections where no apparent connections were there. And that is something that I have carried with me for my entire life. I try to engage with music, honoring my upbringing and not thinking of genre or not thinking of musical style as a division, as a divider, but just something that might elucidate a few parts of that specific way of musicing's culture and history, and always looking for transcultural or polycultural connections.
And when and how did it become central in your life? Were you playing? Were you composing at an early age? When did it begin to take over and kind of define everything that followed and how?
Yeah, so I started later than Susan. I started at 4. So I started 1 year later. And I told my parents that I wanted to study music, and they put me in piano lessons. And at first it was sort of like a Suzuki method kind of, piano lessons. And I told them very quickly that that was not what I was interested in, because even though I kind of liked playing by ear, I wanted to know how to write the
Hmm.
things. I wanted to read and write music. That was a feeling of a wish to engage with the music making from that aspect from very early on. And once I started studying music, it became very clear very, very early on that that was the thing that I wanted to do. So I am one of those odd folks that never wanted to be anything but exactly what I am. I always knew that I was a composer.
And writing from an extremely early age, which is unusual. Did it begin with improvising or literally just writing it down once you learn notation?
Writing. I
Wow.
actually came to become more of a, improvisational composer later on in my life, but my love was to, get the sounds that were in my head into a piece of paper. That act was very attractive to me. It's
And and what yeah, it's very attractive to us to hear the results, so it works out well. Uh, um, when what was some of the first experiences of hearing your music performed? Did you play it yourself or it was already outside of you at an early age?
So for a long time, my teachers were my music theory teachers and my piano teachers. I was not studying composition formally because, people thought that, that's, it's probably a phase, let's just have him engage with music in a very direct way. And I'm glad that that happened because it put me in touch with music making from a performer's perspective, which was very, very engaging. But yes, at first I would play my own piano compositions, or I would bring it to my piano teacher or my theory teachers, who were also pianists, and they would play. Sometimes I would write things for four hands, and we would play together. It wasn't until I was 14 that I actually heard non-piano instrumental music of mine
Mm,
played by other people for the first time, and I still remember that feeling, of seeing that and hearing that, experiencing that, and thinking
mm,
that is it. That is what I want to do.
well, we're very lucky you did, and we'll hear the results in um, beautiful, eloquent form in Ojai. Now let's leap way forward. As I said, you came to the U.S. to study composition at TCU and at Northwestern, and you yourself are now a distinguished professor of composition, having taught at UCSD, among other places, but currently at Columbia University in New York. I mentioned Pan. It really is one of the centerpieces of Claire's extraordinary Density 2036 project. And Pan, of course, is a mythical figure who is a flutist who gave us panpipes. So it's very appropriate. The piece is for solo flute, live electronics, and a beautiful ritual community ensemble that participates in very meaningful ways. A version of Pan was done at Ojai some years ago, but what we will hear is the complete current form of the piece. And I will even confess, which you may not know, that I took part in a portion of Pan performed in Florence, Italy, that Claire did.
Oh, you were there with Alex Ross.
Yes, Alex Ross of the New Yorker and I were among the ones playing wine glasses. But we'll talk
An
about
honor.
that in a minute. Um, Tell us about the genesis of the piece and this very beautiful kind of music theatrical form it eventually took. How did it begin?
So I was still living in Chicago when the conversations about this work that we didn't quite know what it was started, and started between Claire and Jane Sachs, who has the organization Project Ends in Chicago. And Jane and Claire had been talking about creating some kind of work that spoke to the idea of languages, especially endangered languages, languages that were disappearing for whatever reason. And they brought me into the conversation. And again, it was a sort of very amorphous general idea of what we wanted to do. And but it got, it got our brains going for a while. And then I stumbled upon the idea of the story of Pan, which I thought it was really interesting because it in many ways, Pan is the ultimate demigod, not quite a god and not quite human, really sort of this thing in between. And it is also the figure that we associate with the end of paganism and the beginning of religion. So there's this shift on how to understand morality altogether. There's, of course, a direct connection with music, and there's this idea that Pan is what permeates everything we do. And that's why the prefix now pan, is also used for multiplicity or vastness. So once we kind of decided to work on pan, to sort of create a structure out of pan, it became also very, very clear to us that we wanted to somehow create something that went beyond location, beyond geography, beyond a specific history. We didn't want necessarily the piece to be universal, but we wanted the piece to be atopical, to really sort of exist in this mythic place that lots of people could see themselves in, without necessarily borrowing from, very obvious sources. And it was Claire's idea to explore Hildegard von Bingen's lingua ignota, which is the language in which she wrote lots of her prophecies. And it's a combination of archaic German with Latin and but it really is basically Hildegard speaking in tongue, and it's a language that exists and doesn't exist, and we decided to write the entirety of Pan on lingua ignota, which is sort of like we could have chosen Esperanto, for instance, but I think that Esperanto would actually have put it in a very specific time, which lingua ignota, for not existing, for never existing, for not having disappeared because it never actually established itself outside of just Hildegard's practice, kind of gave us that freedom to take it wherever we wanted to take. And it became very clear to us very quickly too that this should be a piece about collective. This should be a piece about connection with other human beings. And as any good Brazilian, when I think of education, my brain goes straight to Paulo Freire, especially his seminal Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and this idea of building knowledge out a collective group, trying to undo as much as possible any sort of hierarchical ways of thinking of dissemination of information, and how to expand information, how to give space to oral traditions and other ways of cultivating knowledge and making knowledge grow that emanates very organically from the practice of doing. And with that in mind, we started workshopping, and Pan was workshopped for many years in many, many formations with many, many kinds of folks. We started with a group of flutists in St. Paul, and then we started working with this senior center and also this middle school and high school in Brooklyn. And then we worked with Syrian refugees, and then we worked with students in the public system in Chicago, and then, so many other folks. And what was really beautiful was that every time that we worked with a set of people, something new would emerge from the work. And we would learn also how to enhance our artistic goals in efficient ways by working with folks. And more beautiful than that even is the fact that when we started in St. Paul and then went to New York to work with the Riseboro folks, some folks from St. Paul came to New York. When we went from New York to Chicago, some folks came from New York to Chicago. So people who entered the piece in a sort of a apprentice kind of capacity became quote unquote masters and were able to shift roles as the piece grew. Um, it wasn't really until maybe 2 years ago that we found a good capsule for Pan. And the way that it exists now, it exists in three versions. It exists in the version for many, many folks. It exists in a more controlled version for 12 performers plus Claire and the electronics. And it also exists in a solo version with a lot of stuff that is pre-recorded. But all of those versions really sort of were the product of much experimentation.
Marcos, let me just take a pause. We have a couple of pictures of the very beautiful San Francisco performance of the work, which gives some feel of this kind of ritual theater of the piece. And here's another image. And as people see it, explain to us this kind of sense of community that the piece engenders. I've described it. Is it fair to call it theatrical and also ritualized? And often the participants are described as a kind of Greek chorus, but let me let you comment on that, and not codify it in my words.
I think that ritual is the right word. It does feel like there is something very I mean, I don't want to use the word religious because it's not it, but there is this sort of communal ritual spirit behind Pan that is in itself a very bonding, very binding experience. We have folks that have participated in different Pans that continue to want to be engaged with the piece. We have, Pan groupies, if you will, that will travel to participate in other Pans, and we're so honored whenever they do it. But yes, the idea was making virtuosic music, complex music, talking about artistic complexities in ways that are accessible, and to not misunderstand or conflate the idea of accessibility with simplicity, to really sort of understand how very, very complex ways of doing art could go beyond one's experience with a musical instrument or on ways of performing music. And what is really, really beautiful is that at the end of the period of putting Pan together, which we went from many months to now something that Claire can do in one afternoon magically and beautifully, efficiently. But to witness those folks, a lot of folks that had never participated in that kind of experience before, feeling not only empowered by the experience, but feeling very knowledgeable on how to inhabit that experience.
And let me also just say here, the participants, the community ensemble, if you will, do not need to have specific music training.
Sure.
It's really all ages, all experiences. And when I proudly said I participated in a performance, it was the first time in my life playing tuned wine glasses, which I promise you anybody can do and requires, and it creates an unearthly beautiful sound. So this is a moment to say for anybody who can be in Ojai in the 5 or so days preceding the festival, we have an open call for participants. And then there's also the ability for those who are, if you will, in the audience to participate. There are participants who are on stage and participants who are off stage, and the setting of Libby Bowl allows that to be really widely scattered and surrounding us in very beautiful ways. So if
And
anybody who's listening to us is tempted to participate, I want to make clear it doesn't require any specific training other than an open and curious spirit and the willingness to participate. So contact the festival office.
if I may further tempt folks, I would also say that the best way of experiencing Pan is performing it. There was even a time when we were putting the piece together that we considered that every performance of Pan should not have an audience. It should just be something experienced by the people doing it, which was a beautiful idea, but limiting in unnecessary ways. But I will say, if people really want to engage with the piece in what I consider the fullest sense of engagement of Pen, it will be an honor to have you doing it with us.
Let's take a couple of moments to talk about the other works, and then we'll have a few minutes for question and answers from everybody. Um, Alone is the music that very beautifully actually begins the festival. Claire has an impeccable sense of kind of the arc of the festival, and it begins with a work called Alone, and it'll end 4 days later with a very exuberant company performance of a brand new piece by Terry Riley called Pulse Field 3. So we'll begin with Alone and end up with an embrace of the whole community of musicians. And Alone, my sense is almost like a pre-pan piece. So tell us, and who else is involved in Alone, or what else is involved?
So yes, I think that Alone or Poe, which is the larger piece, the 1 hour long piece that from which Alone comes from, is really sort of like a pen prototype in many ways. So Poe as a project was a partnership between Claire, myself, and the percussionist Vet Stoyanov, who teaches in Miami, and a project that we developed together, as I usually try to do with most of my projects, to really create music with musicians side by side. And we did it at Mount Tramper in upstate New York. And we had this beautiful poem by Edgar Allan Poe called Alone that we based the entire work on. And I remember that in our first meeting, I arrived with some very, very, very loose sketches, really sort of trying to create as much space for things to emerge out of our conversations. And we spent a lot of time just talking about the poem and what that poem meant to each of us. And the poem starts with from childhood's birth, I was always alone, and this idea that no matter how you navigate through the world and the people that you meet and things that come in and out of your life, that your essence is solitary, or in that person in the poetry. And we spent an entire afternoon just chatting with very, very little sound made. And then we kind of went to our little corners, and Claire was practicing, Svet was practicing in some other place, and I got a piece of paper and a pencil and sat in the main house. And this melody kind of came to my head, and I wrote it down in like 90 minutes, just sort of like really sort of psychographed it, and walked to the shed where Claire was practicing. It was like, how about this? And there was this idea of this drone that we wanted, and I think it was Svet who actually suggested, well, what about wine glasses and whistling? And it was a beautiful moment, really, because in less than 2 hours, the piece was born.
Hmm. That's such an intriguing introduction. I can't wait to experience it live in Ojai. And finally, Chambers is we've talked about these very unusual combinations and unusual births of these pieces. Chamber is a string quartet in a way, and it will be played by the Jack Quartet, a combination of instruments that has deep, deep, deep tradition and precedent. How did Chambers come about, and what's the reference in the title?
Yeah, so Chambers is a reference to Alvin Lucier's book, and who titled Chambers, and it really talks about the act of listening and how spaces sort of influence the way that one hears sounds. So I kind of wanted to create a piece in which, it's three movements, and each movement is my sort of portrait of a specific way of listening, specific way of experiencing sonic matter. And it was a piece that was asked of me by my dear friends in Chicago, the members of the now defunct Spectral Quartet. And a funny story is that back then, in the original formation, Spectral's first violin was Austin Wooleman, who is now the violinist in the Jack Quartet. So Austin has been following the journey of chamber from the very beginning. But yes, it's always intimidating to write new music for very historical formations. And I think it's one of those things that the more you know, the more you can create some mental barriers for yourself. You have these preconceived ideas of what a string quartet is. And the way for me to get out of it was to really think of the people who were doing it, my friends. So there are a lot of things there that sort of enhance and humanize this idea of string quartet and going from a group of strings to four individuals. So for instance, in the first movement, they whistle as they are playing. There is this sort of choreographic things within the piece that really sort of attunes you to the fact that there are four bodies there. And that's how I kind of got out of my debilitating admiration for Haydn, Beethoven, and such.
Marcos, you and I can talk for many hours, which we won't right at the moment, but I'm also happy to say Marcos will be in residence at the festival and participating in the various talks throughout the festival. So you'll have a chance to meet Marcos in person as well in those days in June when we gather in Ojai. But let's switch the screen and see everybody and see if we can just take some questions for the next few minutes.